There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Welcome back, everybody, for another episode of the Your Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms, and as always, I'm joined today by Nephi Cole.
And I'm here still.
And he is here. And Mike McGrady.
That's right.
Who's also here. We have got a controversial topic for you today. Really excited about diving into it. But before we do, want to make sure we get a request out there. If you're listening to this podcast, thanks so much. If you haven't done so already, would you go out to wherever it is that you get this podcast and rate us, leave us a comment, subscribe, let some folks know, pass the word around that this is out here. We'd really appreciate that. Also, as we've said several times, if you have ideas, things you want to hear us take on, podcasts you want to hear, let us know. We're pretty much willing to take on about anything that people suggest, with some limitations, but most anything people suggest. So send us your suggestions. You can do that through Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. Our handles there are at It's Your Mountain. And you can also send us an email at yourmountain at itsyourmountain.com. That's yourmountain at itsyourmountain.com. All right. So we're going to try and do something here that's probably going to generate some serious hate mail. Am I wrong?
Well,
No.
We'll see. We'll see.
Everybody loves horses.
That's right.
They do.
I think everybody around this table loves horses.
So
right?
see, so why
So
did you get hate mail talking
can't be
about something as
controversial.
wonderful as horses?
Yeah, it can't be controversial
Let's
at
talk
all,
about
right?
horses today.
But we're going to talk about horses, and we're specifically going to talk about. This is the first thing I'm going to do that's going to cause people to write hate mail, because I'm going to air quote wild horses. I'm air quoting it.
I thought about this on the way over. So let's just cut to the chase.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what we call them. The vocabulary of what you call them, I agree that the vocabulary of what you call them affects people's perception in their brain, but it's just a moniker.
Yeah. No, you're right. So, people, and so what we're talking about are what are widely referred to as either wild horses or feral horses in the western United
Wild
States.
Mustangs.
Right.
What else?
There's some things that I think are not family friendly that I've heard them
You're
called.
just not gonna throw those
So
out
we're not going to throw them out there. But so what we're going to talk about is the Wild Horses and Free Ranging Burros Act, and sort of what that has done for wild horse management in the West and just general ecosystem habitat management in the Western United States. Before we talk about the act specifically, let's talk about the history of horses a little bit in North America. I think to understand where we are today, you have to understand how we got here.
Yeah. So where do you want to start at?
Maybe the Pleistocene?
Yeah, because that's appropriate.
Well, let's not go too far back.
We're not going to go. This is not going to go year by year, but yeah, I mean, it's safe to say that the horses we had in the Pleistocene are not the horses that we had today. The horses that we had in the Pleistocene were much smaller, and they were extirpated.
Well, but that's an interesting debate. So I don't want to get into the genetics of the horses, right? Because there's a school of thought that says this is from the same genus. That the horses that we have today are from the same genus of the horses that were here 10,000 years ago, right? And really, so historically speaking, you had horses that were in North America starting something like 40 million years ago, right? And they persisted here until about 10,000 years ago.
Yep, give us a size. 10,000 years ago, what are we looking at size-wise?
What do you mean, size of the horse?
Yeah.
Well, I think they were fairly similar. They were slightly smaller, but fairly well. So let me clarify. They were slightly smaller, but fairly similar in genetic composition to mustangs. There was another genus. In fact, I think it was just identified last year in a study. Another genus recently identified that was quite a bit smaller and very different from the horses as we think of them today.
Yes.
Right. They went extinct about the same time. They were found in Nevada, Wyoming, the Yukon Territory. So they're scattered. Scattered around the West as well. But yeah, but size differences aside, genetic composition.
Can we call those ones ponies? Is that not appropriate? Wild pony.
Well, so my point is, there's a school of thought out there that says these were, generally speaking, the same horses. The ones we have today are, generally speaking, the same horses that we had 10,000 years ago. They went extinct, though. Right? They went extinct 10,000 years ago in North America.
Right.
Presumably crossed the land bridge around the Bering Strait, wound up in Asia, Eurasia area, and maintained populations there until they were brought back by the theory is Spanish explorers, right? Or at least European explorers in the 15th century, something like that, 15th, 16th century, brought them back to North America, and those make up part of the horse population we have today.
Yeah. Not a theory, right? I mean, that's what happened.
I think it's a widely accepted theory. Well, yeah.
Proceed, Dr. Wilms.
No. Jump in. I'm just starting this. Jump in anytime. I mean, you have other things you want to add about how they got here?
Hey, I defer to you guys on the biology. I got nothing.
So there, I'm just saying there are two schools of thought, right? There's the school of thought that says these are actually very different from the horses we have today are actually very different from the ones we had.
I would believe
10,000 years ago.
If there was a 10,000 year separation, I would believe that they are separate.
But there is a school of thought also that they are the same genus and effectively the same.
Keep papers coming daily or flunk general science, correct? So we're talking about a relationship.
Yeah.
That's
you just went and did the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, mnemonic device, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so, when we get down to the end of it, I think I don't want to spend too much time on it, but does it really matter? I mean, we're talking about something that was not here, that was clearly reintroduced sometime in the late 1400s. And so we can talk about, the 10,000 year span, how similar they were, but we're not talking about a population that is.
But there was a 9,500 year gap.
That's right. So
where they weren't here.
It's not entirely similar.
We're in North America, but they were on the Earth, and they circumnavigated from Asia to Europe to back to America.
And because they're survivors, they're back.
They're back. So we'll come back to this more as we progress, because I think this is sort of just setting the stage for what was here. So anyway, you have them brought back in the 1500s, and
well, what was the difference in the makeup of North America 10,000 years ago versus the 1600s?
Oh well, yeah, no. For example, the climate was incredibly different.
Okay,
think about there were large parts in think about Nevada today, for example. Mm-hmm. So you think of Nevada today, and it's a very arid. You think of Nevada, you think desert, right? Mm-hmm. Very arid desert, right? For the most part, I'm overgeneralizing Nevada.
Yeah, you are.
I know I am. But when you think of central Nevada and the large sagebrush areas and the places where wild horses persist today in Nevada, it's largely in arid climates. 10,000 years ago, it was a much more temperate climate in Nevada. It's more. It wasn't nearly as dry.
Yeah.
Grasslands as opposed to this sagebrush.
My favorite part is that Utah literally was underwater. It's like a big lake.
Yeah. So you had and we were coming off the end of the last mini ice age, and so you had the global temperature glaciation. Global temperatures were a lot different.
Super cool geology.
And think about this. This part kind of blows my mind a little bit. So we have wild horses that went extinct 10,000 years ago here. But think about some of the large mammals that existed at the same time as wild horses in North America that aren't here today. Saber-toothed tigers, mastodons, woolly mammoths. There was a North American cheetah
Yep.
There was like this super beaver that existed. I don't want. I think he called it a giant beaver, but I call it a super beaver because it's just this gigantic beaver.
I do want to back up just really quick and make sure so I don't get too much hate mail. When I say that Utah was underwater, people, I'm not talking about it was under the ocean. I'm talking about the large lake that now is this, what we call the Great Salt Lake. At the time, before you had a colossal failure of a natural dam there that basically drained most of Utah. Utah was the impact of water in Utah was much greater. The amount of precipitation that was coming off the mountains in Utah really has, it covered a large part of the Salt Lake area, the Provo area underwater. And you can still see the geologic remnants of that today. And the only reason that Provo, Utah is not underwater is a change in climate, because the physical structure is still there to fill that basin up, just not to the level of what we would call the Bonneville High Stand. So back to horses.
All right.
Soil's brown.
So, yeah. So, but it paints a picture. I mean, the West looked vastly different. There were large predators on the landscape in the West at the time when wild horses were here 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Today, wild horses have virtually no predator. Humans would be the only predator, except the Wild Horse and Free Ranging Burro Act really prevents that from happening. And so I want to talk about we'll probably bounce back and forth into the history of this a little bit, but the history leading up to this. But let's talk about the Wild Horse and Free Ranging Burros Act and kind of how. So it was passed in 1971.
Right.
Why? What got us to the point where it was passed?
So horses were put out of the landscape. So post 1500s, horses not only were being used for agriculture purposes, for subsistence, hunting, fishing, all those types of things. People utilizing them as a draft animal. They were, when people needed horses, they'd go collect them. When people got done with them, they'd set them loose. So there were quite a few quote unquote wild horses, were free roaming horses, whatever you want to call them. That was part of the American landscape for hundreds of years. Correct?
That's correct. Horses were also hunted. They were part of the American landscape. People go round them up to use them, but it also, in tough years, people weren't shy about eating a horse.
Yeah. Well, I think Lewis and Clark. You look at, it's the worst case scenario when you have to eat your car, but sometimes that happened.
They ate a boat.
Yeah. So you're right. That's a good perspective that they'd been turned out on the landscape, and the populations had started to grow. But then what? Oh, I'm looking at Mike.
Oh,
he's
you're
got
looking
this
at me?
blank look on his face.
Oh,
I thought maybe he knew. We talked about her before.
Oh yeah, Wild Horse Annie.
Wild Horse Annie.
Well, sure. There was an effort put forward to try to protect the horses on the range.
But
right? Why? Why did Wild Horse Annie want it? I don't know.
So there has to be something, right? There has to be something that triggered her to become this big advocate.
Yeah, I don't have an answer.
So she saw abuse of the paradigm. So the things that were going on, she saw people collecting these horses that were free roaming, whatever you want to call them, and she did not appreciate the position that she saw them in. There was either animal abuse, or they were in situations that was poor. And as Americans, like, hey man, I love horses. And I think we all do. And there's a certain level of discomfort when you see an animal that, basically to me, and I've had a number of them, and I love horses more than most and not as much as some. But like when you see an animal like that, that's that.
Well, it's interwoven in the culture of the country, in the growth of the country. I mean, it was the mode of transportation for hundreds of years. I mean, it was, they were part of American culture.
It also got to a point where it was no longer the mode of transportation, and they were on the landscape and being rounded up, right, through a variety of means, chasing with helicopters, roping them, trapping them.
Yeah, they called them the Mustangers, right?
Right.
Yeah, and there were alleged abuses of these animals. The treatment of them was allegedly pretty poor. They were sold for commercial purposes, different types of commercial purposes, and
right.
Dog food, glue, whatever.
Right. All sorts of stuff. Whatever.
Right. Yeah. That gets to the sort of the idea we were talking about yesterday on the movie Misfits with Marilyn Monroe. And they were at a rodeo down in Arizona, and one of the scenes is where they do a roundup. And there's a helicopter, there's trucks, they're roping them, forces them to drag heavy tires behind them until they wear down, and then they send them off for whatever. And Marilyn Monroe just breaks down and starts yelling at him for it. And I think that was a
powerful social moment.
Yes, I think a powerful social moment, and it captured a lot of different.
What year was that movie?
I don't know. It was
would have been in the 1950s.
Black and white. Yeah, that sounds right.
Because it was in the 1950s that Velma Johnston, the Wild Horse Annie, really started this advocacy push.
I always suspected there was a tie in there somewhere.
Probably a tie. Yeah. So the first law that came about in response to her push was in 1959, and as we get into this discussion more, you'll see the irony in where this law came from. But it was proposed by a U.S. representative from Nevada, Walter Bering, introduced the first bill, and it prohibited the use of motorized vehicles to hunt wild horses and burros on public lands. And you'll see the irony, because when we start talking about some of the issues that the social and ecological issues that wild horses are causing, Nevada is at front and center on this. They're experiencing a lot, and so it's sort of interesting. This push was originally to protect horses.
Horses in Nevada now that has the highest population.
Right.
Yeah.
So that happened in 1959, but this Velma Johnston, Wild Horse Annie, she didn't like it. It didn't go far enough. It didn't. She wanted to see a program established at the federal level that would protect and manage and control the wild horses and burros on the landscape. And this bill didn't do it, so she advocated that we go a step farther.
Yeah, and I think protect is the important word that you use, rather than, we can say manage, but really heavy protection is what she wanted to see.
That's what it's turned into, I think. I don't know if that was originally, and that might be true. You might be right, if that was originally the purpose. But the original language in the Wild Horse and Free Ranging Burros Act, I think was, and Mike can probably speak to some of this because he's worked on the issue some, but it was more flexible. The protection in one sense was, we're going to prevent exploitation and poor treatment of the animals, and protection in that sense. Right.
I think you could draw some parallels to the Endangered Species Act and the amendments that occurred there too. So in 1971, the Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burros Act was passed to prevent the capture, branding, harassment, or death, because Congress at that time foresaw that the wild horses were fast disappearing from the American scene. So they passed a law that basically establishes protections for the wild horses and burros on the landscape. It says that basically we're going to keep them wherever they exist today. We're going to keep them. And back in that day, there were only about 25,000 wild horses on the landscape. And so they were going to designate herd management areas and figure out, what level to manage them at. But as far as the direct management from the Bureau of Land Management, which has delegated authority down from the Secretary, it basically says that the BLM, you're going to work with an advisory board, and you're going to talk to them, and you may decide to destroy old, sick, lame horses in the most humane manner, and you can cause excess wild horses to be removed for private maintenance and humane conditions and care. So that was in the original 1971 Act. But by 1978, a few years later, the numbers had escalated to the point where there was concern that it was no longer meeting the number one goal, which was to maintain horses in a thriving natural ecologic balance with all other species in the landscape on the rangeland. And so you can see, if you look at the reports out of Congress in 1978, they're saying that, in the case of the wild horses in the western states, Congress acted in 1971 to curb abuses which pose a threat to their survival. The situation now appears to have reversed, and action is needed to prevent a successful program from exceeding its goals and causing animal habitat destruction.
Yeah, so what you had is this original idea of protection. This happens a lot. People take a snapshot of where it is today, and they're like, that's what they base things on without thinking necessarily further into the future and what the ramifications of the...
Yeah, so it was widely successful.
Yeah.
Too successful. And so with the 78 amendments, they changed the verbiage. They no longer have to rely on an advisory board. There was a little bit more discussion expected with the state wildlife management agencies. It was contemplated originally, but a little bit more. And essentially, they said that when the secretary has information to know that there are excess animals that are threatening that thriving natural ecological balance, then you got to go and round them up, right? And there were provisions in there on what to do with them. And it, like before, talked about what to do with the old, sick, and lame ones. It also talked about adoptions and a variety of other options for getting those numbers out into the hands of folks that could use them.
Are they still euthanizing old, sick, and lame horses?
Yeah, it can happen because when you see it now, it's usually when the gather, which is somewhat similar to a roundup, when they gather them up and they're doing whatever they need to do, sometimes they discover that it's just more humane to put one down. So it's not a lot of numbers, but it happens.
But it's not a lot of them.
No,
and in the grand scheme of things, it's really not a lot of them, right?
Right.
So,
how many are there today?
Well, first of all, you mentioned in 1971 there were 25,000 roughly horses and burros. This covers both. That isn't just horses and burros. About 25,000 today, as in 2018.
Before you get there,
yeah.
So there were 25,000 at the time of passing in 1971, horses and burros. They have determined that the landscape, if you're going to balance that thriving natural ecologic balance, if you're going to make that occur, then you're going to max out at about 27,000. But
now you've made me want to tangent because, when you go back to the history of the act, and one of the reasons behind passing it was there was this concern that the population was plummeting. Right, that we might soon lose these horses, and when they passed the law, the horses that were left were pretty darn close to capacity.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was saying when I said, this is interesting how people, we find something we love, we take a snapshot, and we want to protect it like it is. They were probably taking a look at that 25,000 and were like, oh my goodness, we can't let anything happen to these 25,000 horses. They probably didn't have in their head, most people, most legislators who are good intention didn't have in their head that by protecting this number, we're going to create a huge problem for lots of other stuff on the landscape.
Well, yeah. So they set up a structure that precludes state management. It's relied,
which was upheld by the Supreme Court,
right,
in Kleppe v. New Mexico.
Right, that was a wild horse case.
That was a wild horse case in 1976, I think, 78.
Somewhere around there.
Right around there.
Yeah. And so you are relying on one agency and its budgetary constraints in order to manage one species.
The Bureau of Land Management.
Right. And so who has determined we got 25,000 of these on the landscape today. The landscape can sustain 27,000, but when you impede the ability to actively manage, the species grows at a rate of 15 to 20% a year.
It can double in 4 years.
So that means it can double in 4 years.
So where are we at today?
So we have 82,000 horses and burros on the landscape in 10 states, on BLM and private, and some national forest.
So almost triple.
In 10 states, which is it's more than triple, right?
I can't do math.
Well, you had just over 25,000. You have 82 now. So 25 times 3 is 75.
27 times 3. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have more than 3 times the number of horses and burros on the landscape today as when the act was passed. That's on range. That's on range.
Yeah, that doesn't count everything that's been adopted / moved off to.
Because Mike touched on it, that there's a program in place to try and remove excess horses from the landscape. And it's done. They remove them. Like Mike said, they can euthanize the old and the weak and
old, sick, and lame.
Old, sick, and lame, which isn't very many. So the vast majority get put into holding facilities,
right? Rather than because there's the range, right? The herd management areas, and then when they're removed, they're taken to corrals, and then the corrals are a system that are sort of BLM owned facilities that are sort of like a stockyard, and that's where they work on what to do with them, adoption or whatever. But there are long-term holding facilities that are a more pasture setting,
like large grasslands.
Correct. Yeah.
Sometimes several 100,000 acres.
Right. So they remove them from their existing habitat in the sagebrush and send them to Kansas where it's grassland.
Right. So, exactly. And those numbers right now. So in 2017, there are about 48,000 that are held either in the corrals or on these pastures. 48,000 horses.
So almost twice as what was in existence in 71 are now being held long term by the Bureau of Land Management and off-site facilities.
Yeah, and so the idea behind this was great. I mean, it was the thought, well, the public loves horses. We'll take them off the range. We'll have programs in place where we can break these horses. We can train them. Yeah. We can put them up for adoption or even sell them, and it'll just be the source for horses.
Let's just say this: the demand is not there.
The demand's not even close to there. So, what did I say? We had 48,000 in captivity, basically, off range. In 2017, we had one of the highest adoption totals we've seen.
Yeah.
3,500, just a shade over 3,500
you
adoptions.
Didn't know this, but I had a BLM adopted horse.
Did you?
A pack horse. We called her the Shady Lady. So she was shady, very shady.
So did you when you got her? Was she?
I actually got her from a friend. We made a deal. He needed me to pick up some horses and move them for him. And as part of the instead of giving me gas money, he just gave me this horse. So
was it already broken?
You know what? You could not ride her, but she was a great pack horse. You could put a bear on her, and she didn't freak out at all. Huh. The only problem with this is when you put her in a pack string. This would be too much information for some people, but you put her in a pack string. Every time she had to take a dump, she'd quit walking.
Stops the whole string.
So you put her in the string. So if you put her in the pack string, right? You could only have you couldn't put her in a line with other horses because whoever's told the Shady Lady, she stops and then you hook the back horse to the front horse with a piece of twine in the tail. She breaks the twine and screws everything up every time she has to take a duke. So
all right, so
it's terrible.
To sashay back to the the podcast. So part of the problem with the fact that we have that many horses in long-term holding facilities is fiscal, right? So the Bureau of Land Management annually has a budget of about $81 million. 60% of that goes to that off-range management. So that's about $48,000 for one.
$48 million.
$48,000 for one unadopted horse that remains in BLM's care over its lifetime. So the total cost of caring for 46,000 unadopted and unsold animals currently is holding will top out at $1 billion over their lifetimes.
Yeah, I got to sidetrack really quick. One thing I took a lot of heat. I'm not a big Twitter user. You guys know this story. I'm not a big Twitter user. And now I'm even less so after I did this one tweet.
Your first one, right?
One of my very first tweets.
Go ahead.
And it tells you I haven't been involved very long because it was after the government shutdown earlier this year. So we had the government shutdown for a few days here in 2018, I believe, right? Or is it 2017? Whenever it is. It was in the past year. So anyway, so we had the government shutdown. And during that time, the only thing funded were essential functions of government. Right. Most of the government was shut down. There was no money for it, but they did have at least some patchwork to have continuing funding or to have funding for essential functions of government. Mm-hmm. One of those essential functions of government was caring for these horses in captivity.
Yeah.
And I just made a comment on Twitter that said, generally speaking, the government's going to continue paying to feed these wild horses and caring for these wild horses during the government shutdown. But should caring for wild horses be an essential government function? That was the essence of my statement.
Yeah, it worked out well for you, didn't it?
It worked out really well. I became a poster child for a while. It's the closest thing I've ever had to a tweet that went viral.
You're so famous, you're infamous.
Yeah. But I had like almost, it felt like bounties on my head from the crowd that said, here's an anti-horse guy. And I was just pointing out that we have an incredibly expensive program.
Sure.
And that even when the rest of government shuts down, we have to keep these horses alive.
I'll tell you, I had a friend in state government in an unnamed state, but about the same time period, there was a whole lot of heat about wild horses, and somebody sent a picture to him, and this picture said it was a horse trailer hauling, like 2 horses in like a 4-horse trailer, and just like, stop this cruel carnage! You're taking these animals away from their home, and he said he sent them a response that said, "This clearly is not our state because the trailer is too small."
Oh.
That was a joke, everybody.
Yeah, no, I got it.
But it highlights we've got some real management challenges.
So I just want to maybe put a finer point on something that we talked about earlier on the exponential growth, because it ties into the costs. The costs that I just quoted from the BLM's recent report to Congress essentially says, okay, that's those we have, and over their lifetime it's going to cost that, but
$1 billion.
Right.
Reemphasize that.
But you got to remember they're still breeding on the landscape. Yeah, so a single stallion usually breeds 6 to 8 mares, which are females, a year in his own harem, but he has a capacity of siring 50 or more foals in a year if he has access to the mares. An adult mare can produce a foal every year if she's healthy and in good condition. So typically about 70% of the mares in a herd have a foal each year.
Yeah. And
how long can they live in the wild? They're pretty long lived.
In the wild, I don't know.
They're still pretty long lived in the wild.
20 plus, right?
Right around. I think it might be under 20 years, but around that point.
Yeah, and so it
depends on the condition.
It's also worth noting. So for those that don't know, that as we talk about these quote unquote wild horses, we are not just talking about there weren't just 2 horses dumped off in 1490, and those horses breeded, and then their son and their son and their son. We're talking about additions also annually.
Yeah, like people from your grandpa.
Yeah, my grandfather says, I love being tied to this so nicely in so many ways. But my grandfather, from Idaho, a ranch, ran ranches, and moved to California for a while. When he moved from Idaho, he took his horses out to the wilds and of Wyoming, kicked them loose, because he couldn't take them to California with him, and he just let them go. And that didn't just happen in the early 1960s. That happens every year.
Right.
Every year, somebody decides that they can't afford to feed their horses anymore. And although the BLM values that horse at $50,000 over its lifetime, a lot of horses when hay is expensive, horses are, $500, $1,000, $1,500 is the, going rate for a horse. And for some people, they got it for a 4-H project or whatever, and suddenly they can't afford to pay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the point is, this isn't just the remnants of horses,
legacy.
A legacy that becomes one of the things about horses is they're so ingrained in, like we talked about earlier, so ingrained in our society, but they're so ingrained in the hearts and minds of people. And there's folks from all over the country that maybe haven't spent a lot of time in the West, but they idealize the West, right? Mm-hmm. They create these personifications of what the West should be, and in their eyes, wild horses are a symbol of a wild West and of the history and culture of the wild West.
And I know that some people would wave a magic wand if they could get rid of them, and would get rid of all of them.
Well,
I wouldn't.
Yeah.
No.
But so how? Yeah. So let's talk about that, because right now under the Act, really the options for dealing with them are pretty limited. Right? They have them in the holding facilities. They do adoptions. They do They'll do some sales. Then they're trying to come up with other programs like, for example, sterilization of horses in the wild to reduce breeding, right? So you slow the population growth because it's getting so cost prohibitive to do all these roundups. But there are frequent legal challenges to that approach, and it's not that effective either.
Well, yeah. So it's been determined that some of the original chemicals that they were darting essentially the mares with were not always effective. They've come up with different sort of chemical mixes and things to try to find more effective ones, but it is largely dependent upon booster shots and
they're only
gathering.
Good for a year.
The methods
Well,
being used
some of
for
them are
management
longer.
are just simply ineffective.
Well, but they might be good for a year or a little longer, but then you have to do a booster. You have to be on the ground. You have to relocate.
Yeah.
Some
You're
are
talking
some
about
are
serious manpower, serious pharmaceuticals. You're talking about a lot of work, a lot of money from agencies that don't have it, expertise that isn't there, too many animals. The management paradigm just isn't up to snuff.
And as far as other forms of sterilization, if you start to get to the male horses, the counter argument that is thrown out there is that when you are performing those surgeries, you are adjusting the hormone levels in the males and sort of their testosterone type situations, and so they are not going to be gathering up the harems. The herd dynamics are changed, and so it's no longer the same thing as it is today. Of the idyllic image of wild free-roaming horses when they just are no longer themselves.
So why can't we do more?
The act.
No, it's not the act.
The act-
The act itself has plenty of language that describes a host of options about what to do that
I would question
that
whether
are
they're
considered
effective.
Well, there are options that are considered unmentionable or unthinkable to some people.
Like what? Let's mention them and talk about them.
Well, sure. Slaughter for horse meat consumption or other byproducts. And I think so. Those
Which
things
they don't do right now.
They don't. So the original act would allow for that. That comes in under riders for appropriations that basically say that the USDA can't go out and certify a facility to do this particular activity.
So for people who don't understand that, I mean, what you're talking about is if you're going to have meat go into the human food chain, you got to run that through either a state facility if it's going to be sold in state, or you have to run it through a USDA facility so you can get the stamp. Well, currently there are prohibitions to being able to pay for any facility or an individual to slap that stamp on that would say this is suitable for human consumption. Absent that stamp, it is illegal for that to enter into the chain, the food chain.
Would either of you guys eat horse meat?
I would.
I'd try it, but I've eaten crow, and you've eaten prairie dog, so I don't think we have high standards.
And Nephi's eating horse.
Yeah, I spent some time in France, and this is a really rare thing. So just let's be honest that for people that think that if there's a myth that is like, oh, this happens all the time over in Europe, all the time, there's a lot of gray area in what that means.
There might have been a time.
Yeah, there certainly was. And you only have to look at when things get more expensive, when the economics didn't make sense for one thing and the availability is there for something else. Then it was more common. There are operations currently in Europe in a great variety of places where horse slaughter and then butchering and those things are. I mean, it's like cattle.
It's not just Europe. I mean, it's
it's
all
throughout
over the world,
right?
Yeah, but not necessarily in the United States.
Well, so let me ask you guys this: would you, if you could, would you hunt horses?
Yeah. And now here's the thing. I've had this debate with somebody. When somebody said, so what should we do? And to me, this is the kernel of the debate. If we're calling these animals wild horses, and we say we have 25,000 animals is what our capacity can support, what is the sense in having state wildlife agencies that are going to manage, whether it be buffalo, whether it be elk, whether it be something else, and they're going to manage to a certain number using a tool that's very effective, that's cost effective, that is humane, which is hunting is all those things, and where you get basically a group of private individuals rather than paying the federal government to take care of this. You got a group of private individuals who will go out, harvest animals and keep them in an ecological balance, and that's what's happening in every state in this nation. And then they're taking that home and putting it in their freezer and feeding their family over a year or maybe more in the case of based on the size of these animals. The question I have is, why wouldn't you use that same tool to manage what you are calling wild animals, wild horses, on that are living in these same landscapes with mule deer, with elk, with antelope? Why not do it?
Well, let me ask you this:
Doesn't it make more sense?
Can you think of another large North American mammal, if we want to call this a North American mammal, right? And that's what we're debating.
Which I do.
It lives in North America. We'll call it North. So, can you think of another large North American mammal where we have really no lethal control options? I mean,
loaded question.
Other than those things that are
on the endangered species.
Not true, though.
Well, no. Are you talking about hunting, or are you talking about the ability for a state to do management actions?
I'm talking about management actions by a state. Yeah. And even under the Endangered Species Act, there are options. You're working with the federal government, but you can have management options.
Can be. There's flexibility.
It happens with every large mammal that's listed right now that I know of.
Right. Yeah. As a practical matter, it does, and there's a mechanism for that, but not within the
the year before gray wolves were taken off the endangered species list in Wyoming, there were more wolves killed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in control actions than by hunters in Wyoming the year after they were taken off the list. More while they were listed killed in 1 year than by hunters when they were under state control. So, I mean, the point is, there are these species you think about that they're listed, so we must not be able to have any lethal control. But we do. This seems to be one of the only species, at least large mammal species, that I can think of, where we've made a policy decision that we're, for the most part, there is for the most part a no-kill policy.
Yeah,
and I wonder a little bit I think I know where that comes from, but I wonder, is that the right policy decision for the landscape? And I say that because, building off of what you said, Nephi, I think if you love wildlife, if you love wildlife in the West,
if you love a healthy
ecosystem, if you want to maintain the suite of species that we have at robust numbers we have today, and you want a landscape that can support all those species.
If you want to be equitable with all the species in the landscape.
Right. So if you're a hunter, or even if you're a general environmentalist, if you just care about if you're in the agriculture industry, if you care about this, you have to question some of the management that's been done.
Yeah. And it's worth for
with
those
wild horses.
With those that don't know, you've got to let's look at this, understand all those other species on that landscape are being managed. So, and for those that don't know, we're talking about whether it's cattle, there are the numbers of those, the grazing of those is managed, whether it's elk, whether it's whatever else. These animals are being managed to a certain population number so that they can cohabitate with the other stuff that has to live in that same ecosystem.
You know what I want to do? I feel like we're just on the brink of turning this into a really cool dialogue about maybe how horses should be managed with the rest of the ecosystem, and maybe how the Wild Horse and Burro Act, how we should consider applying it in the future. I think we should do another one of these. I think we should stop this podcast right now.
Well, first,
and I think we should pick
I think that's
this,
a great idea, but you threw me under the bus. Would you hunt a horse?
You're the one that jumped on it.
Yeah.
The thing is, for people to say, like, I'd say, like, as a guy who loves them, my favorite animal in the entire world is elk. Like, if you're going to give me like one, get out of jail free card to save whatever's left on the planet at any given time, what I'm going to save, it's going to be elk. I think they're the most majestic animal on earth. I love being around them, and so to me, it seems kind of ridiculous for someone to say, "Oh, you like that animal, so you can't see managing that animal or putting that animal in your freezer." I think we need to have a more educated, thoughtful discussion about an issue like this. And I would bet money that the methodology would work.
So let's pick this up on our next dissection episode. Let's continue this discussion on wild horses, and I will start that next episode by answering your question,
All right.
Nephi. I will let you know at the beginning of the next episode whether or not I would hunt a horse, and I'll tell you why. My answer is what it is. Deal?
Done.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Catch the rest of this one in 2 weeks. We'll have a long form in between. Catch the rest of this one in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, just remember, life is about experiences, so go have one.